February 25th, 1956. Rudu, West Berlin. 3:47 a.m. Bill Harvey pressed his ear against the concrete wall, listening to the methodical scraping of Soviet shovels above. The CIA's Berlin operations base chief had been dreading this moment for 11 months. Through 476 feet of carefully excavated tunnel, past 18 months of the most audacious technical intelligence operation in Cold War history, the game was finally up. East German engineers had accidentally broken through into the tap chamber while repairing a cable fault. Harvey could hear their startled voices, then urgent radio chatter in German and Russian. What Harvey didn't know, what no one in the CIA or British MI6 would know for another 5 years, was that the Soviet officers now documenting his elaborate underground listening post weren't surprised at all. They'd known about Operation Gold since the day planning began in 1953. They'd watched the Americans dig. They'd allowed 50,000 hours of telephone conversations and 6 million hours of teletype traffic to flow through CIA recorders. And they'd done it all on purpose. The greatest intelligence coup of the 1950s was also its greatest deception. But the question that would haunt Cold War analysts for decades wasn't who won or who lost. It was far stranger. Why would the KGB let the Americans listen? In the summer of 1953, Allen Dulles believed he'd found the perfect answer to America's Berlin problem. As the newly appointed Director of Central Intelligence, Dulles faced a fundamental challenge. The Soviet military occupied East Germany with 22 divisions, yet the CIA couldn't reliably intercept their communications. "We're flying blind in the most dangerous city in the world," he told the National Security Council. "We need to hear what they're saying to Moscow." The solution came from an unlikely source. British intelligence had successfully tapped Soviet cables in Vienna by tunneling from a basement in the British sector. When MI6 shared their techniques with the CIA in early 1953, Dulles saw an opportunity to replicate the operation on a far grander scale in Berlin. The city's unique geography made it perfect. Soviet communication cables ran through shallow conduits just inside the eastern sector, tantalizingly close to the boundary line. American confidence ran high. Bill Harvey, chosen to lead the operation, had built his reputation hunting Soviet spies in counterintelligence. "The Russians are good, but they're not that good," Harvey told his operations team. "They'll never think to look underground." CIA planners estimated they could tap into 3 major Soviet military cables carrying communications between East German headquarters and Moscow, potentially intercepting orders to the very divisions that might one day roll west toward the Rhine. British intelligence was equally enthusiastic. George Blake, a trusted MI6 officer who'd survived torture in a North Korean POW camp, served as the key liaison between London and Washington on the project. His linguistic skills and understanding of Soviet procedures made him invaluable. "Blake knows how the Russians think," one MI6 superior noted. "If anyone can help us anticipate their security measures, it's him." The strategic logic seemed flawless. Unlike aerial reconnaissance or human intelligence, a cable tap offered continuous, comprehensive access. Every order, every status report, every mundane administrative message would flow through American recorders. As CIA officer David Murphy later recalled, "We weren't just getting intelligence. We were getting everything. The entire nervous system of the Soviet military apparatus in Germany." Both the American and British intelligence communities believed Operation Gold represented a new frontier in technical intelligence. The CIA had recently established its technical services staff, and Berlin offered the perfect proving ground. "We're not sending agents into the field where they can be caught and shot," one CIA planner explained. "We're using technology to level the playing field." The operations cover was elegant. The Americans would construct a warehouse and radar installation in Rudo, a quiet neighborhood in the southwestern American sector near the border. The building's basement would house the tunnel entrance. Once complete, the warehouse would serve as a legitimate communications facility, its real purpose hidden beneath tons of concrete and clay. Soviet observers might notice new construction, but they'd see only another Cold War outpost in a city bristling with military installations. Western intelligence had every reason for confidence. Soviet security doctrine focused on countering human penetration, background checks, surveillance, and periodic purges. Technical operations like cable taps existed at the edge of Soviet imagination. "They're still fighting the last war," a CIA analyst noted, worrying about sleeper agents and midnight defections. They haven't adapted to what's possible in the technical age. The road to Berlin's tunnel began in Vienna's sewers. In 1949, British intelligence officer Peter Lunn discovered that Soviet military communications cables ran through shallow tunnels easily accessible from the British occupation zone. Working with British Post Office engineers, MI6 successfully tapped the cables and recorded Soviet traffic for nearly 3 years before the operation was compromised. The Vienna experience proved that cable taps were technically feasible and strategically valuable. When Lunn arrived in Berlin as MI6 station chief in 1953, he brought his expertise and ambition. Berlin's divided status created unique opportunities. Unlike Vienna, where all 4 occupation zones clustered in the city center, Berlin's Soviet sector formed a distinct geographic entity, and unlike the carefully guarded inner German border, Berlin's sector boundaries remained relatively porous in 1953. The wall wouldn't rise until 1961. CIA planners identified the perfect target in early 1953. 3 major Soviet cables converged at a junction point in Alt-Glienicke, just 900 feet inside the eastern sector. The cables carried communications for the Soviet military's group of Soviet Forces Germany headquarters in Wunsdorf, the East German Interior Ministry, and assorted military units. Tapping all 3 cables simultaneously would provide unprecedented insight into Soviet operations across eastern Germany. The engineering challenge was immense. The tunnel would need to run 1,476 feet from the warehouse in Rudau, descending 18 feet below ground before rising slightly to meet the cable conduit. Unlike Vienna's existing sewer access, Berlin required digging a completely new tunnel through Berlin's sandy soil and groundwater. The excavation would need to remain undetected by Soviet security patrols just overhead, by East German border guards, and by the sophisticated seismic sensors the Soviets had deployed along the sector boundary. Bill Harvey took command in September 1953. A legendary figure in CIA counterintelligence circles, Harvey had helped identify Soviet agent Harold Kim Philby before Philby fled to Moscow. Harvey brought ruthless attention to operational security. He limited knowledge of the tunnel to an extremely small circle, using separate teams for different phases of construction. Even the Army Corps of Engineers officers who helped design the tunnel's ventilation systems didn't know its true purpose. Construction began in September 1954. The CIA had purchased the Rudau site months earlier, and workers built the warehouse and radar installation first. German construction crews were told they were building a standard military communications facility. Only after the surface construction was complete did the real work begin. American engineers excavated the tunnel in complete secrecy. Working entirely at night to minimize noise, they removed over 3,000 tons of sandy soil. The dirt couldn't simply be trucked away. Suspicious KGB watchers might notice increased truck traffic. Instead, the excavated soil was distributed beneath the warehouse basement floor, gradually raising the foundation. Every bucket of dirt was carefully weighed and documented. The tunnel itself represented remarkable engineering. American contractors lined the shaft with steel segments, creating a tube 6 feet in diameter. Sophisticated air filtration systems prevented condensation that might create telltale fog at ventilation points. Sound dampening materials absorbed the noise of digging. Hydraulic equipment kept the tunnel from flooding as workers broke through several underground springs. By February 1955, the tunnel had reached the Soviet cable conduit. The most delicate phase began. British post office engineers, working with American technicians, carefully installed taps on all 3 Soviet cables without interrupting service. Any break in transmission would alert Soviet technicians to tampering. The taps had to be electrically invisible, drawing current so minimal that Soviet engineers checking for cable resistance would detect no anomaly. The tap chamber itself became a technological marvel. Recording equipment filled the enlarged chamber where the cables entered from above. American technicians installed amplifiers, filters, and reel-to-reel tape recorders, 57 separate pieces of equipment operating continuously. The entire system drew power from a cable running back through the tunnel to the warehouse, with backup generators ready to engage if primary power failed. What no one knew was that George Blake, attending every planning meeting and reviewing every technical specification, had been reporting the entire operation to his KGB handler since the summer of 1953. Blake, recruited by the KGB during his captivity in North Korea, had provided Moscow with complete details. The tunnel's route, the target cables, the timing, even the technical specifications of the tapping equipment. The KGB faced a delicate decision. Shutting down the operation immediately would expose Blake and destroy the most valuable penetration Soviet intelligence had achieved in British services. But allowing the tunnel to operate meant letting the Americans intercept genuine Soviet communications. KGB chairman Ivan Serov and his deputies chose a middle path. Let the tunnel function, but carefully manage what it heard. May 11, 1955. 8:23 p.m. The tap chamber. The recorders came alive. After 3 months of testing and calibration, Operation Gold went operational. In the cramped underground chamber, tape reels began turning, capturing the first Soviet telephone conversations. American linguists listening through headphones heard Russian officers discussing routine matters, supply requisitions, leave schedules, equipment maintenance reports. It seemed almost too easy. What the Americans were hearing was real, but it was also performance. In Moscow, the KGB had issued extraordinary instructions to Soviet military commanders in Germany. They were to conduct normal operations, but certain topics were absolutely forbidden from telephone discussions. Nothing about nuclear weapons capabilities, nothing about war plans for Western Europe, nothing about intelligence operations against NATO. For extremely sensitive matters, officers received orders to communicate only through in-person meetings or special encrypted channels that didn't use the tapped cables. The deception required remarkable discipline. Thousands of Soviet officers and civilian officials used the tapped phone lines daily. Most had no idea they were being monitored. The KGB couldn't risk warning them because someone might accidentally reveal the secret to American agents. Instead, a small group of senior KGB officers carefully orchestrated what the Americans would hear. For Bill Harvey and his team, the intelligence windfall seemed unprecedented. Within weeks, American recorders were capturing 200 Soviet conversations daily and processing over 150,000 teletype characters per day. The CIA established a processing center in London, where dozens of Russian-speaking analysts transcribed, translated, and analyzed the take. Army Security Agency linguists joined the effort. Even British intelligence, despite their junior partnership role, received copies of transcripts. The material covered Soviet military logistics in extraordinary detail. American analysts learned the names and assignments of hundreds of Soviet officers. They mapped the Soviet order of battle across East Germany with unprecedented accuracy. They discovered maintenance problems with Soviet tank divisions, identified training exercise schedules, and tracked troop rotations. The intelligence seemed to confirm everything the Americans believed about Soviet military capabilities and intentions. "We're seeing the entire Soviet machine in Germany laid bare," a CIA analyst wrote in a classified assessment in October 1955. "From commanding generals to supply sergeants, we're hearing their actual voices, reading their actual messages. There's no deception possible at this scale." But there was deception, and it was happening at precisely that scale. The KGB's approach was subtle. They didn't fabricate messages. That would require coordinating too many unwitting participants and might create inconsistencies that sharp American analysts would detect. Instead, they shaped the information environment. Sensitive operations were conducted outside the tapped communication channels. Officers received training in communication security without being told why. And crucially, the KGB ensured that most of what the Americans heard was genuine operational traffic. Mundane, truthful, and ultimately low value. The KGB's strategy relied on a fundamental insight about intelligence analysis. The Americans would assume that communication security this poor reflected Soviet incompetence. They'd believe the intelligence was authentic because it confirmed their existing prejudices about Soviet backwardness. And they'd never imagined that the Soviets knew about the tap and were deliberately managing their own compromise. Through the summer and fall of 1955, the CIA's confidence grew. The tunnel produced 443 reels of magnetic tape monthly. Processing centers in London and Washington worked around the clock. Analysts tracked Soviet military reorganizations, identified new weapons systems arriving in East Germany, and monitored the political reliability of Soviet officers. When Nikita Khrushchev consolidated power after Stalin's death, American intelligence tracked the resulting personnel changes through conversations on the tapped lines. The operation's security held perfectly. CIA teams replaced recording equipment, maintained the tunnel's environmental systems, and processed the intelligence take, all without detection. The warehouse above remained a functioning radar station. Soviet and East German border guards patrolled just overhead, completely unaware of the sophisticated technical operation beneath their feet. In Moscow, KGB officials watched the American self-congratulation with grim satisfaction. They were achieving a double victory, protecting their most valuable agent while feeding American intelligence services a carefully curated version of Soviet military reality. The information wasn't false, but it was incomplete, and the Americans would never know what they were missing. The irony was exquisite. It was Bill Harvey, the counterintelligence expert who'd helped unmask Soviet penetration of British intelligence, was running an operation that had been compromised from its inception by another Soviet penetration of British intelligence. The Americans were being betrayed by the very ally helping them conduct the operation. By early 1956, the tunnel had intercepted communications for nearly a year. The CIA began planning a similar operation in another divided city. The technical intelligence model seemed proven. If we can replicate this in other locations, one CIA planning document suggested, we'll have a sustainable strategic advantage in technical intelligence collection. But the KGB was already planning the operation's end. Keeping George Blake's identity secret meant eventually discovering the tunnel through seemingly innocent means. The challenge was timing. Shut it down too soon, and the Americans might suspect deliberate compromise. Wait too long, and the risk of Blake's exposure through other means increased. The KGB chose to wait until the tunnel had been operating long enough that its discovery would seem like natural attrition rather than operational failure. The discovery of the tunnel on February 25, 1956, triggered immediate reaction on both sides. Soviet and East German officials orchestrated an elaborate public response. Within hours, communist newspapers trumpeted the exposure of American imperialist espionage. East German police photographed the tunnel equipment extensively, and Soviet officials invited Western journalists to tour the facility. The propaganda value was immense. Here was physical proof of American intelligence operations, complete with sophisticated recording equipment bearing U.S. military markings. The Soviet reaction told us everything, CIA counterintelligence officer Peter Duryabin later observed. They made it public immediately, which meant they wanted political points more than counterintelligence advantage. The Americans interpreted Soviet publicity as exactly what it appeared to be: embarrassment management. The Soviets had been caught with poor communication security, so they shifted blame by exposing American espionage. Western intelligence agencies drew precisely the wrong conclusions. The Berlin Tunnel entered CIA legend as a successful operation that ended through bad luck rather than compromise. Bill Harvey received the Distinguished Intelligence Medal. British intelligence shared in the accolades. MI6 officer George Blake, who'd helped plan the operation from the beginning, continued his trusted work in Soviet operations. In reality, the KGB's management of the tunnel's closure was as careful as its management of the operation itself. They'd waited until the tunnel had produced enough intelligence to make its compromise seem plausible. Not so soon that American counterintelligence would suspect deliberate exposure, but not so long that Blake might be compromised through other means. The timing reflected sophisticated thinking about counterintelligence tradecraft. The CIA learned technical lessons from the tunnel's physical exposure. Soviet engineers had documented the American equipment thoroughly, which meant future technical operations would need different approaches. CIA technical services began developing even more sophisticated tapping equipment that would be harder to detect and easier to disguise. The tunnel's discovery accelerated American investment in satellite reconnaissance, which offered similar advantages without the vulnerability of physical presence in hostile territory. But the deeper lesson, that the operation had been compromised from inception, remained unknown. The CIA continued recruiting Soviet and Eastern Bloc sources, not realizing that one of their closest allies harbored a KGB agent at the center of joint operations. Blake continued working for MI6, assigned to teach new officers at the intelligence training facility in Kent. His position gave him access to the identities of British agents being trained for deployment behind the Iron Curtain. Soviet intelligence exploited this window ruthlessly. Armed with Blake's information, the KGB arrested dozens of British agents across Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. Between 1956 and 1961, what appeared to be a catastrophic series of security failures was actually the systematic roll-up of British intelligence networks based on Blake's betrayals. Yet British counterintelligence, still riding the triumph of the Berlin Tunnel, failed to connect the losses to a single source. The Americans, meanwhile, had drawn their own conclusions from the tunnel's intelligence take. The 443 reels of tape and 6 million hours of teletype traffic painted a picture of Soviet military capabilities that seemed comprehensive. CIA analysts developed detailed assessments of Soviet tank divisions, identified vulnerabilities in Soviet logistics, and concluded that Soviet forces in Germany were oriented toward defense rather than offensive operations. These assessments were accurate, but incomplete. What the tunnel hadn't revealed was precisely what the KGB had kept off the tapped lines: nuclear weapons capabilities, war plans, and intelligence operations. American military planners based their strategies on tunnel-derived intelligence that, while truthful, lacked the most critical information about Soviet intentions and capabilities. They were making decisions based on a curated selection of facts. The technological lessons from the tunnel rippled through American intelligence community. The National Security Agency, working with CIA technical services, began developing next-generation intercept capabilities. The Berlin Tunnel proved that technical intelligence could provide sustainable access to Soviet communications without the vulnerabilities of human agents. This lesson would shape American intelligence priorities for decades, sometimes at the expense of human intelligence operations that might have detected betrayals like Blake's. By 1960, the CIA had moved beyond ground-based cable taps to explore satellite reconnaissance and electronic intercepts. The U-2 reconnaissance aircraft, while vulnerable as Francis Gary Powers' shoot-down proved, represented the evolution of technical intelligence thinking that the Berlin Tunnel had pioneered. American intelligence increasingly invested in technological solutions to Cold War intelligence problems. In Moscow, KGB officials counted the tunnel operation as a significant success. They'd protected their agent for 8 years. From his recruitment in Korea in 1951 through the tunnel's operation and beyond. They'd managed American perceptions effectively. And they demonstrated that Soviet intelligence could conduct sophisticated counterintelligence operations at a level matching or exceeding Western capabilities. The KGB's handling of the tunnel became a case study in Soviet intelligence training, though the full details remained secret even within Soviet intelligence circles. The tunnel's closure also affected tactical intelligence sharing between British and American services. The CIA began conducting more unilateral operations, particularly in technical intelligence. While the formal alliance remained strong, American intelligence officials grew more cautious about sharing operational details with British counterparts. This subtle shift would have important implications for transatlantic intelligence cooperation in subsequent decades. The truth about Operation Gold remained hidden for 5 more years. Then, on April 22, 1961, George Blake was arrested at his home in London. British counterintelligence had finally connected the pattern of blown operations to Blake's access. During his interrogation, Blake confessed to being a Soviet agent and revealed that he'd betrayed the Berlin Tunnel before the first shovel broke ground. The revelation devastated Western intelligence services. "We thought we'd won," one CIA officer later reflected. "We'd congratulated ourselves for 11 months of successful operations, for the intelligence coup of the decade. And the whole time, the KGB was reading our mail. The psychological impact equaled the operational damage. If the Soviets could compromise an operation this sensitive, what else did they know?" The intelligence community's reassessment of the tunnel's take began immediately. Analysts pored over the 443 reels of tape with new eyes. What had seemed like comprehensive intelligence now appeared carefully curated. The conversations were real, but significant gaps became apparent. Why had nuclear weapons capabilities never appeared in any of the intercepted traffic? Why were certain Soviet units never mentioned? Why did operational planning discussions always occur through other channels? The answer was stunning in its simplicity. The KGB had orchestrated an elaborate deception by managing what wasn't said. "They didn't feed us disinformation," one CIA analyst concluded. "They fed us selected truth and let us draw our own conclusions from incomplete information." The sophistication of this approach marked a new phase in Cold War intelligence operations. The British intelligence service suffered the more severe blow. Blake's betrayal wasn't limited to the tunnel. During his post-tunnel career, he'd compromised over 400 British agents operating across Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. Dozens had been arrested and imprisoned. Some had been executed. Blake had systematically dismantled British intelligence networks while being entrusted with training new agents. As one MI6 officer bitterly noted, "We gave him the keys to the kingdom, and he handed them to Moscow." Blake's trial in May 1961 resulted in a 42-year sentence, the longest ever imposed by a British court. The judge's comments reflected official fury. "You have betrayed your country. You have rendered much of our intelligence operations useless. You have exposed British agents to imprisonment and death. Yet even at trial, the full extent of Blake's betrayal regarding the tunnel remained classified. The KGB's sophisticated handling of the tunnel forced a fundamental revision in Western intelligence thinking. We'd assumed that technical intelligence was inherently more reliable than human intelligence, a classified CIA assessment concluded. The tunnel showed us that even technical operations can be compromised and manipulated. There's no such thing as a silver bullet in intelligence collection. This lesson would influence American intelligence strategy throughout the Cold War. Soviet intelligence, meanwhile, celebrated a masterful operation. The KGB had protected its most valuable British penetration for nearly a decade by sacrificing a technical intelligence source that was already compromised. They'd allowed the Americans to build an expensive tunnel, process millions of hours of intercepted communications, and draw conclusions from carefully managed information. The cost-benefit analysis, from Moscow's perspective, was overwhelmingly positive. The tunnel's ultimate intelligence value remained debatable. The 50,000 hours of voice communications and 6 million hours of teletype traffic did provide genuine insights into Soviet military operations in East Germany. Despite the KGB's management, American analysts gained valuable information about Soviet logistics, command structures, and tactical capabilities. But the most critical intelligence, the information that might have revealed Soviet strategic intentions, was precisely what the KGB had kept off the tapped lines. The human cost of Blake's betrayal extended far beyond the tunnel. British historian Christopher Andrew later estimated that Blake's information led directly to the deaths of dozens of Western agents. The moral weight of this betrayal haunted intelligence professionals. "We can accept operational failure," one veteran officer reflected. "What we can't accept is knowing that our own operations got people killed because we trusted the wrong person." For Bill Harvey, the revelation was personally devastating. The counterintelligence expert who'd helped identify Soviet penetration of British intelligence had unknowingly worked alongside another Soviet agent on the most sensitive technical operation of the decade. Harvey's career continued, but the Berlin Tunnel's compromise would follow him. In the intelligence community's assessment, he'd presided over a technical success that was simultaneously a counterintelligence failure. The Berlin Tunnel's true story, an operation compromised from inception yet allowed to continue for Soviet intelligence purposes, revealed fundamental truths about Cold War espionage. It demonstrated that even the most sophisticated technical operations could be turned against their operators. It showed that intelligence agencies could simultaneously achieve tactical success and strategic failure. Most importantly, it proved that the KGB's counterintelligence capabilities matched or exceeded Western assumptions. The tunnel's legacy shaped subsequent Cold War intelligence operations in 3 key ways. First, it accelerated the American shift toward satellite reconnaissance and electronic intelligence that didn't require physical presence in hostile territory. Second, it created lasting skepticism about joint intelligence operations, subtly straining the U.S.-British intelligence partnership. Third, it established counterintelligence, the protection of operations from hostile penetration, as equally important as intelligence collection itself. The tunnel operation also revealed the limits of technological solutions to intelligence problems. "We thought we could engineer our way around the human factor," one CIA officer later reflected. "The tunnel showed us that even the most sophisticated technical operation depends on people, and people can be compromised." This lesson resonated through American intelligence failures across subsequent decades, from the betrayals of Aldrich Ames and Robert Hanssen to the damage caused by Edward Snowden. From Moscow's perspective, the tunnel demonstrated that Soviet intelligence could conduct sophisticated long-term operations requiring extraordinary discipline across thousands of participants. The KGB's careful management of what the Americans heard while protecting George Blake's identity, represented counterintelligence tradecraft at its most refined. It also showed the value the Soviets placed on protecting human intelligence sources, even at the cost of technical security. For historians, the tunnel offers a perfect window into Cold War paradoxes. Both sides could legitimately claim victory. The CIA gained valuable intelligence about Soviet military capabilities. The KGB protected their most valuable British penetration and demonstrated superior counterintelligence. Both claims were true, which meant that declaring a winner missed the point entirely. The tunnel illustrated how Cold War intelligence was a continuous game where tactical victories and strategic failures could coexist. The most unsettling lesson emerged only in retrospect. American intelligence community made strategic decisions based on tunnel-derived intelligence about Soviet capabilities and intentions. Those decisions were based on real information, but information that the KGB had deliberately allowed them to collect. The implications were profound. If adversaries could manage what you discovered, they could influence what you believed, which ultimately shaped what you decided. The tunnel showed that intelligence manipulation didn't require false information, only incomplete truth. Today, as intelligence agencies grapple with cyber espionage, encrypted communications, and digital surveillance, the Berlin Tunnel offers enduring lessons. The fundamental challenge remains identical. How do you know if what you're collecting is what your adversary wants you to find? That question, asked in the darkness of a Berlin tunnel in 1956, still echoes through intelligence operations worldwide. The technology has evolved beyond recognition, but the human factor, the George Blakes who can compromise any system, remains the most persistent vulnerability in any intelligence operation. In the end, the Berlin Tunnel's greatest legacy might be what it revealed about Cold War intelligence itself. That nothing was quite what it seemed, that victories often contained the seeds of failure, and that the most dangerous adversary was always the one you never suspected was there at all.